December 23rd, 1938. Carnegie Hall, New York. A sold-out crowd in black tie, waiting for the most ambitious showcase of Black American music ever staged. The producer, John Hammond, walks to the microphone. He has one announcement to make before the show begins. His star act, a young blues guitarist from Mississippi, is dead. He was 27. Hammond motions to a pair of stagehands. They wheel out a phonograph. He sets the needle on a record, and the voice of Robert Johnson fills Carnegie Hall for the first and last time.
I love this morning. Our blues walking like a man.
You know what happened next? Johnson became the most mythologized musician in American history. He sold his soul to the devil at a crossroads in Mississippi. He played with a power no human being could have learned honestly. And at 27, the devil came to collect. But what if the most famous story ever told about him actually happened to someone else? Here is the Crossroads story, the way it's been told for 60 years. You go down to a crossroads just before midnight. You bring your guitar. You sit there and play, alone. A large black man walks out of the darkness. He takes your guitar, tunes its strings, plays a piece, and hands it back. You can now play anything you want. The deal is done. That story has been attached to Robert Johnson since the 1960s. It is the creation myth of rock and roll. And it has a problem. There is no evidence that Robert Johnson ever told it about himself. But we'll come back to that. First, who was Robert Johnson? The honest answer is, for a long time, almost nobody knew. For decades, there were only 2 verified photographs of him in existence. A third surfaced in 2020, held by his stepsister Anya Anderson for over 70 years. He had no birth certificate. When blues researcher Mac McCormick spent 3 decades trying to reconstruct his life, he hit so many dead ends, imposters, and contradictions that he titled his manuscript Biography of a Phantom and never published it. McCormick died in 2015. The Smithsonian released the book posthumously in 2023. Even the biography became a ghost story. What we do know. Robert Johnson was born in Hazelhurst, Mississippi in 1911. An outside child, the product of an affair, he grew up bouncing between towns, between father figures, between lives. He learned to make noise on a diddley bow, a single string nailed to the side of a house, and he hated picking cotton. He wanted to play the blues. The problem was, he couldn't. The bluesman's son House, himself an ordained minister, remembered a teenage Robert Johnson hanging around the juke joints, begging for a chance to play during the older musicians' breaks. House said Johnson's playing was painful, a racket. He had to tell the kid to stop. Then Johnson disappeared. When he came back, roughly 2 years later, he sat down and played with a skill that left the veterans silent. How does a kid go from clearing rooms to silencing professionals in 2 years? Son House said it was the devil. The real answer was stranger. When Robert left town, he went looking for his biological father. He didn't find him. Instead, he found a man named Isaiah Ike Zimmerman. Ike Zimmerman was a guitarist from Alabama, a family man living near Beauregard, Mississippi. Robert asked him to teach him. Ike agreed. Robert moved in with the Zimmerman family for about 2 years. Ike's children said they thought of him as a brother. They called him R.L. So where does the graveyard come in? Ike had a practical problem. He played juke joints at night, but when he wanted to practice without waking his wife and kids, he needed somewhere quiet. The Beauregard Cemetery was right across the road. Robert joined him. For 2 years, master and student sat on tombstones playing guitar until the early hours of the morning. The sounds drifting out of that cemetery at midnight probably did sound otherworldly, but the source was two men doing repetitive, disciplined work. The Zimmerman family has said that some of Robert Johnson's most famous recordings, Rambling on My Mind, Walking Blues, possibly Dust My Broom, and Come On in My Kitchen, were either written by Ike or co written by the two of them out among the graves. When Robert came back to the Delta, his playing had transformed. Nobody knew about Ike Zimmerman, so the only explanation that made sense to people was a supernatural one. But if the devil didn't teach him, where does the Crossroads story actually come from? You heard the ritual at the top of this video: midnight, guitar, a dark figure, a deal. Robert Johnson never claimed any of that. So who did? A different Johnson. Decades before Robert became famous, there was another Mississippi bluesman, no relation, named Tommy Johnson. Tommy was a showman. He played guitar behind his head, between his legs, threw it in the air, and he understood how to build a reputation. On September 8, 1966, Tommy's brother LeDell, by then an ordained minister, sat down in his home with a young UCLA researcher named David Evans. Evans was a graduate student in the folklore and mythology program, and he was there to record a conversation about Tommy's music and repertoire. He wasn't asking about the devil, he wasn't asking about the crossroads. But partway through the conversation, LeDell started talking about how Tommy could make a song in 10 minutes, how he knew so much about music. And then, completely unprompted, LeDell said his brother had told him the reason. Tommy had sold himself to the devil.
Me and him would play for some white folks here, and he'd just set up and just sit there and fumble with his box. And he could make a song. He could make a song in 10 minutes. And I'd ask him now if Tom was living, he'd tell. Now he done told him that my wife tell. He said the reason he knows so much, said he sold himself to the devil. I asked him how. He said, if you want to learn how to play anything you want to play and not learn how to make songs yourself, said you take your guitar and you go where a road crosses that way. Crossroads. Where a crossroad is. And said, get there, be sure to get there just a little before 12 o'clock that night so you will know you will be there.
That's the actual recording. The Reverend LeDell Johnson, September 8, 1966, with his wife Mary sitting beside him. Nobody asked him about the Crossroads deal. He volunteered it, mid-conversation, completely spontaneous, because he was talking about his brother's talent. And I want to acknowledge Dr. David Evans directly here. He recorded that interview, he shared the original transcript with us, and he gave us a first-hand account of what happened next. What I'm about to describe comes from the man who was in the room. Evans wasn't the only person studying this kind of folklore at UCLA. He and his fellow graduate students were taking classes from Professor Wayland Hand, a specialist in folk belief and superstition. The idea that musicians could gain supernatural skill through a deal at the crossroads wasn't new to any of them. It was a widespread motif in black folklore across the American South, applied to fiddlers, guitarists, singers, not just Tommy Johnson. Evans documented this breadth in his 1971 book on Tommy Johnson, citing variants collected in Harry Middleton Hyatt's fieldwork on hoodoo and rootwork traditions. After Evans recorded LeDell, he returned to Los Angeles and discussed the findings with his circle of fellow graduate students. Among them was a man named Pete Welding. Welding heard the Crossroads story and made a specific connection. Robert Johnson had Crossroad Blues. Robert Johnson had Me and the Devil Blues. Robert Johnson had a mysterious, unexplained skill leap. This story sounded like it belonged to Robert. So Welding went and interviewed Son House, the veteran bluesman who first noticed Robert's transformation. And here's what makes this so clear-cut. Evans and another researcher, Al Wilson, had already interviewed Son House in November 1964. House said nothing about the Crossroads, nothing about a deal with the devil, and House had been interviewed by other researchers before that. Everyone asked him about Robert Johnson. He never brought it up, not once, to anyone. Until Welding. According to Evans, who knew Welding, studied alongside him, and watched this unfold, Welding got carried away. Evans believes Pete asked Son House a leading question, something along the lines of, "Did Robert Johnson sell his soul to the devil?" And House, who was old by then, went along with it. As Evans put it was a general belief that blues was the devil's music. House didn't need much convincing to agree with the suggestion.
I think Pete asked a leading question. I wasn't there, but Son, I think, gave a kind of hesitant answer that seemed like it left open that possibility.
Welding published it, and Son House never repeated the claim in any subsequent interview. He said it once, to one person, who came in with the idea already formed. By the time white rock musicians in the 60s and 70s started rediscovering Robert Johnson's records, the Crossroads myth and Robert Johnson were permanently fused. Nobody remembered Tommy. Nobody remembered that the same story had been told about dozens of other musicians across the South. It became Robert Johnson's story, and Robert Johnson's alone. The researchers Barry Lee Pearson and Bill McCulloch later confirmed in their book on Robert Johnson that House's Crossroads statement was unique to the Welding interview. And about Crossroad Blues, the song that supposedly proves the deal?
He stands at crossroads, tries to flag a rise.
If you listen to the lyrics, it's about being a black man stuck on a dark road in the Jim Crow South, trying to hitch a ride before nightfall. In 1930s Mississippi, that was a survival problem, not a supernatural one. Robert wasn't entirely innocent in this. He recorded songs about walking with the devil. He cultivated a dark image. He never corrected the rumors. And Evans points out that Robert was almost certainly familiar with the Crossroads tradition. It was everywhere in the culture he came from. But Crossroad Blues, as you just heard, doesn't play along. In his other songs, he leans into the devil imagery. In that one, he doesn't. As Evans put it, very confusing. And maybe that confusion is the most honest thing about it. But the specific Crossroads ritual, the midnight meeting, the figure who tunes your guitar, that was Tommy Johnson's version of a much older, much wider tradition, grafted onto Robert by a graduate student who thought it fit better. And we can see exactly how it happened because the man who was there told us. And Tommy probably didn't invent it either. The Crossroads as a place of power traces back to Yoruba folklore from West Africa, specifically to Eshu, sometimes called Papa Legba, a trickster deity who guards the intersection between the spiritual and human worlds. That belief survived the Middle Passage, adapted in the American South, and when it met Christianity, Eshu became Satan. A West African spirit of choice and destiny became the Christian devil. The story Tommy Johnson told LeDell wasn't about selling your soul. It was an echo of something centuries older. So the skill came from Ike Zimmerman. The Crossroads came from Tommy Johnson. But there's one part of the legend left, the death at 27, and that story has problems too. By 1937, Johnson had recorded all 29 of his tracks across 2 sessions, in a hotel room in San Antonio and a warehouse in Dallas. He recorded facing the wall, which some later interpreted as hiding the devil in his eyes. Researcher Elijah Wald has suggested he was simply shy. Others think he was working the acoustics of the corner. Nobody knows for sure. Then John Hammond came calling. He wanted Robert Johnson as his star blues act for the From Spirituals to Swing concert at Carnegie Hall, December 1938. But Johnson was already dead. He was 27. Hammond played his records on a phonograph to a sold-out house. Robert Johnson's debut at the most prestigious venue in America was posthumous. The most detailed account of what happened comes from David "Honeyboy" Edwards. In August 1938, Robert was playing a juke joint called Three Forks near Greenwood, Mississippi. Robert had a habit of playing directly to women in the crowd, other men's women. That night, according to Edwards, the juke joint owner discovered Robert was involved with his wife. A bottle of whiskey was sent to the stage, already opened, already laced. Another musician there that night, Sonny Boy Williamson II, born Rice Miller, claimed he knocked the bottle out of Robert's hand and warned him. Robert reportedly snapped back and drank from a second, also already opened, bottle. Edwards described watching Robert deteriorate over the following hours, convulsing, crawling on the floor. He was taken to a nearby house and died a few days later. His death certificate says, "No doctor." On the back, a note, partly handwritten, records a local plantation owner's opinion that the young man died of syphilis. Historians have largely dismissed this. Syphilis doesn't kill a 27-year-old in days, and researchers of the Jim Crow South have documented the pattern. When a black man died under unclear circumstances, syphilis was the convenient default. It saved the county the cost and trouble of an actual investigation. The poisoning account is the most consistent with the symptoms described by the people who were actually there. But there was no doctor, no autopsy, and no investigation. We're left with the testimony of friends and the dismissal of authorities who wrote syphilis on the back of a death certificate and moved on. Even his death got absorbed into the myth. The devil came to collect. The hellhound caught him. 27, the cursed number. Those versions are more satisfying than the likeliest explanation: a jealous husband and a poisoned bottle in a roadside bar. But whatever actually killed Robert Johnson, the response tells you something the myth never will. Whose deaths got investigated in 1930s Mississippi and whose didn't? He has 3 separate headstones in 3 different cemeteries across Mississippi, and researchers still argue about which one he's actually under. Robert Johnson didn't get his gift from the devil. He got it from Ike Zimmerman and 2 years on tombstones. The Crossroads deal was Tommy Johnson's story, repurposed by a grad student in the 60s because it seemed like a better fit. And the death at 27 wasn't cosmic justice. It was most likely a poisoning, filed under syphilis because the victim was a black itinerant musician in Jim Crow, Mississippi. 3 photographs, 29 songs, 3 graves, and a century of other people deciding what his story means. Special thanks to Dr. David Evans, Professor Emeritus of Music, University of Memphis. The 1966 field recording of Reverend LeDell Johnson and the original interview transcript are used with Dr. Evans's permission. His book Tommy Johnson is a primary source for this episode, and Dr. Evans provided first-hand testimony during production. If you like the video and want to be notified as soon as a new episode is released, please consider hitting the like button and subscribe. And if you want a specific historical topic that might be unknown to a lot of people covered here, leave a comment. Thank you for watching and stay curious.